I'm very honoured to be with you today and hope that I'll be able to share some ideas and perspectives that you may or may not agree with, but that's part of the whole process of debate, discussion, and how we move things forward. I chose as today's theme multiculturalism versus liberalism because although I'm a great supporter of multiculturalism as a principle and a value and an ideal, I do see problems with the way it's often interpreted. Here we are, 1 year after the 65th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a true milestone in world history and in the evolution of human rights. But even in the United Kingdom, let alone the rest of the world, those human rights values are under ceaseless attack. We see in our own country the frequent tension between issues of race, religion, gender, and sexuality. We see the way in which different communities claim different traditions and different values and seek to defend that difference. There is, I think, among some sections of liberal opinion, now a considerable fear about overtly and strongly defending liberal humanitarian values for fear that some communities might be offended. Now, I would never go out of my way to offend someone gratuitously, but I think that sometimes, to challenge injustice, you have to say and do things that some people may find offensive. I don't believe it is a human right to not be offended. And if you look throughout history, some of the greatest, most esteemed people who've moved human civilization forward have been deemed to be deeply offensive in their time. When women championed the right to vote, so many people found this deeply offensive. When Charles Darwin or Karl Marx or Sigmund Freud wrote their great doctrinal theses, these were very deeply challenging ideas which disturbed the public consensus and caused great offense to many people. But to me, the right to cause offense is a human right. Not for the sake of it, but in order to safeguard the principle of free speech and freedom of expression. Sadly, I think today, as I said, there are some sections of liberal and left opinion who have become rather reluctant to challenge certain orthodoxies in some communities. I'll just give you, just two very simple examples. Some of you may recall the tragic murder of Damilola Taylor in South London some years back. Now, we don't know, beyond the people convicted, exactly the full story about the events leading up to his murder. But we did know, even from his own parents, that he was being bullied and taunted and abused and violently attacked because he was perceived to be gay. Now, I'm certain the 10-year-old boy probably has no idea about their sexuality, but that was the way he was treated. But in order to not upset the black community, the police played down, indeed covered up, that history of homophobic bullying that poor little Damilola Taylor had suffered. So there's an example of how to appease a community or a section of the community, sometimes what is right is not always followed. The other example is, of course, an instance where some people, and I emphasize some people, in the Muslim community have defended their right to treat women and gay people in a certain way, a way which is not compatible with human rights. And as a result, those people who are victims of misogyny within the Muslim community have often felt abandoned, not only by people in their own community, but by liberal human rights people who they would expect to defend them. And a classic example of this is the way in which, until very recently, so-called honour killings or honour murders and female genital mutilation were not given the attention that they required and deserved because of a fear of upsetting some people in minority communities. So my view is that we need to be really, really careful. We don't want to upset or offend people unnecessarily, but when it comes to defending human rights, we have to be prepared to be robust and to challenge those who would deny them. We have seen historically something of a hierarchy of oppression. I think historically, racism has been deemed to be worse than misogyny or homophobia or anti-Semitism. And this hierarchy of oppression has often resulted in the rights of some people in our society, like women, for example, not getting the respect and defence that they deserve in the name of, quote, cultural sensitivity and respect for diversity. So what I'm really trying to say is that I'm a great, passionate supporter of multiculturalism, but I think we also need to be careful about how it's interpreted and that we don't allow that support for a very good principle of accepting cultural diversity and the right to be different, that we don't allow that to spill over into looking away from the way some people in our society are being abused. If we look at the law of this country, in theory, we're all supposed to be equal in law. But in fact, in law, some people are deemed to be more equal than others. And, it's often the case that race and religion trump sexuality and gender. As you know, we've got a range of fantastic equality laws which have evolved over the last decade or so. Yet every single one of them has written into them limited, qualified exemptions for religious organisations. Not just places of worship, but also faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and shelters for the homeless. In certain circumstances, these faith-run institutions are permitted by the law to discriminate in employment and in the provision of services. Now, of course, in a multicultural society, I accept the right of people of faith to hold their views, and I will defend their right against those who would take it away. But I don't believe it's right that they should be above the law, that they should have special, unique, privileged exemption from the law that applies to everyone else. Another example, some of you may be familiar with a number of Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers who have put out records that openly advocate the murder of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people. They variously advocate shooting, hanging, burning and drowning queers, sodomites, or in their language, batty men. Now, interestingly, shockingly, the BBC and other radio stations used to play these songs for 10 years. It took a 10-year campaign to get the BBC to stop playing those tracks. And the arguments the BBC would say was, it's their culture. To which my response, well, apartheid was the culture of white Afrikaners, but that didn't make it right. Successive Home Secretaries, both Labour and Conservative, have given these singers visas and work permits to come and perform in this country. And the police in certain parts of the country have gone out of their way to protect these singers, to protect them against protests. Now, if a gay person was advocating killing black people, they'd be arrested, put on trial and be jailed. And quite rightly. Incitement to murder is a very serious criminal offence. My question is, why doesn't it apply across the board? Another example, some of you may be familiar with the case of an Islamic cleric in 2004 who openly advocated the murder of Jews and Hindus. He was promptly arrested, put on trial, and jailed for 9 years. At around the same time, another Islamist cleric in East London, he advocated the killing of gay people. He wasn't even taken to court, despite 4 witnesses having heard his open incitements to murder. So what I'm trying to say is there are some real double standards. And although I don't know for certain, in both those cases, I was told by people in the Crown Prosecution Service and the police, they did not want the prosecution of those Jamaican reggae singers or that Islamist cleric in East London because there were sensitive cultural issues and we don't want to inflame community tensions. What about the tensions of Hindus and Jews who were targeted, or the community tensions for gay people who were also targeted? I think that it's great now that we do recognise that crimes like female genital mutilation and honour murders are crimes, and there are new efforts to tackle them and to protect the victims. But it has taken a very, very long time when too many people looked the other way because they thought, well, we're in a multicultural society, we have to accept that different people have different values and different ways of behaving. I think it's really important to assert the principle of universal human rights. Really important. Some of you, of course, will recognise that the multicultural ethos, which began and sort of first initiated, I suppose, in the 1960s, was certainly a very progressive turn compared to the monoculturalism of the 1950s. To me, it's great progress to be able to recognise, celebrate and respect diverse communities. And it's true that multiculturalism has empowered hitherto marginalised and disadvantaged minorities. It's led to greater understanding. It's ended that monoculturalism of the past. So to me, the right to be different is a fundamental human right, and the right to express that difference is a really important human right, which actually enriches our society. We are enriched as a nation by having this diverse multicultural society. The right to be different is an important fundamental human right, but of course, providing it doesn't infringe on the rights and freedoms of others. When I look back at the past, you think about racial segregation in the deep south of the United States, the total criminalisation of homosexuality in the UK, the glass ceilings that so often prevented women from progressing in their careers. We're moving beyond that. We have moved beyond it, although there's more work to be done. Multiculturalism has given those people, those groups within society, an uplift. It's given them a space in the public sphere. It's given them an identity, a dignity, a respect, a value that perhaps they didn't have 50 or 60 years ago. So those are all good. But what about the downside? I think that by asserting and celebrating difference, multiculturalism can sometimes divide people on racial, religious and other grounds. It can overly emphasise and highlight the differences, which can easily spill over into rivalries and antagonisms. There are parts of Britain where there is real tension between Hindus and Muslims, between Afro-Caribbeans and Africans. And this to me is a sad reflection on the way in which our society has become somewhat fragmented, that we've lost sight of the common good. I think that some interpretations of multiculturalism can subvert our common humanity and undermine those notions, those important, cherished notions of universal rights and freedoms. What we can sometimes see is a new form of social tribalism, whereby society is fragmented into myriad diverse communities, many of which perhaps have a primary loyalty to themselves rather than the collective welfare of society. In particular, I suppose, you could say that a certain interpretation of multiculturalism has paved the way for the splintering of the humanitarian agenda, where people are fragmented according to their different and sometimes competing identities, values, and traditions, and that these differences are sometimes prioritized over our shared experiences and interests. I believe that our common needs and the universality of human rights should not be downplayed. It needs to be asserted and defended as a fundamental value, which of course stretches way back to the Enlightenment. And it strikes me as strange that we have to keep on defending it. I don't want to overly rake over old coals, but some of you will remember the way in which Ken Livingstone, when he was Mayor of London, in the name of cultural diversity and the defence of Muslim communities, allied with right-wing Orthodox Islamists to invite and host at City Hall Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. He was hosted at City Hall despite his truly horrendous views opposing the rights of women, LGBT people, and even Muslims who don't share his particular interpretation of the faith. Meanwhile, liberal progressive Muslims like Sheikh Akwani from Iran, Irshad Manji, Sheikh Mohammed Yusuf, and many others had the doors of City Hall closed in their face. On a related issue, I mean, we can see the way in which around the world, taking the global picture, something like 700 million Muslim women and girls have their life choices often limited, not always, but in some societies limited by social, family, community, and religious pressure. Pressure to wear the hijab or the burqa, pressure to not leave the house without a male guardian in attendance, and of course the closing down of many, many employment opportunities that they may face. And I think that some liberals have tended to go along with that on the grounds that this is a different culture, we must understand its traditions, we must respect the right of different cultures to act in this way and to behave according to their particular norms. My view would be that we have a duty to support people within those societies who are defending the principle of universal human rights. You know, in every society around the world, in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Uganda, Russia, and many other countries, there are people who are defending the principle of universal human rights, who are challenging the orthodoxies of their political and religious leaders. I think, as an internationalist, it's very, very important that we support them in their efforts to secure their societies embracing the principle of universal human rights. I often ask myself, when you look at the global picture, people say if you want to defend human rights in other countries, this is a new form of cultural imperialism. Well, I say to myself, well, is it really cultural imperialism to assert that every human being in every country has human rights and has the same rights, should have the same rights as you and me? If you took that view, we would have never supported the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. We would have said that's a matter for South Africans to resolve. It's their culture, it's their tradition. We mustn't interfere. But of course, we as the West shouldn't interfere, but we should give solidarity to people in those countries who are activating and motivating change. I don't believe that asserting the principle of human rights universally is a Western imposition or interference. We must never forget that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was not, as some people claim, a Western invention. It was created by a college of people from all continents and cultures who contributed to writing down those basic core principles. And it has been agreed by all the nations of the world. All the member states of the United Nations sign up to the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we're not seeking to impose Western values upon other countries. We are simply supporting those within the countries who want their leaders to uphold the principles of human rights for their own people. Iran is, I suppose, a classic example. I don't support any Western military attack on Iran, although that's somewhat faded compared to what it was a few years ago when there was a real danger that there may be Western military intervention there. But what I find strange is that many of the people who, on the liberal left, who led the campaign, the rightful campaign, to oppose an attack upon Iran, are largely silent about the horrendous human rights abuses in that country. The jailing and arrest of trade unionists, women's rights activists, lawyers, students, human rights defenders, gay people, and of course particularly the minority nationalities of Iran, who suffer great and grave ethnic persecution at the hands of the Tehran regime. To me, just as much as it's important to oppose a war on Iran, it's also important to support and defend the people there, to give a voice to their cry for democracy and human rights. I think that in terms of where we are now, the defense of multiculturalism is important, but as I said, with the caveat, providing it doesn't result in the denial of freedom and rights to others. It must never be allowed to act as a cover or an excuse for tolerating, let alone acting on, human rights abuses. For me, I continue, despite the flaws of the interpretation sometimes, I continue to defend multiculturalism. It is, I think, overall a force for social good, providing it doesn't promote values and practices that sustain prejudice, injustice, and suffering. To me, a good and beneficial multicultural society is the one in which all citizens have the right, the freedom, to pursue their own different values and lifestyle, while in the public sphere, all citizens are treated as equals under the law, and that we are bound together by a shared commitment to the principle of universal human rights, regardless of the differences we may have in our own personal morality and our private lives. So I don't require people of faith to approve of homosexuality or equal rights for women, but I do ask them to not discriminate and to not preach hatred and discrimination. Christian fundamentalists who believe that homosexuality is wrong, they are entitled to hold that belief in a free society. But they're not required to be gay themselves. No one's saying that. They're not required to give their approval or sanction. Christian husbands of wives who believe in a gender division of labour, that a man should do certain tasks and a woman should do others. Well, I'm sad they think that way, but that's their right. That's their right. They can lead their domestic lives accordingly, but they've got no right to insist that their particular morality, their particular homophobic and patriarchal interpretation of Scripture should become law and be imposed upon everyone else. Where I think multiculturalism has somewhat gone off the rails is in its institutionalization of difference in the public sphere through initiatives like the state funding of faith schools, which I believe does factionalize pupils along religious lines. Another big error is to bow to demands of cultural sensitivity by permitting some communities to be exempt from the norms of human rights that apply to everyone else. And I mentioned, of course, the past neglect of issues like female genital mutilation and honour murders, and indeed incitement to homophobic violence. In the past, of course, the great liberal tradition was to oppose all oppression and stand in solidarity with all oppressed people. The race or religion or cultural background of the perpetrators or the victims was irrelevant. If people were suffering, the liberal view was to defend those people and to oppose those who did the persecution. But I do think that we have seen a new moral and cultural relativism gaining ground, where we're told that every community is different with different values and different ways of dealing with issues, that all these differences are equally valid and must be equally respected. As I said, to question them, to challenge them, is said, or often said, to be a form of cultural imperialism. Now, of course, it's true that there is no one-size-fits-all blueprint for every society and every community. But there are certain universal humanitarian values that I believe should be defended in all cultures at all times. I don't think it's true that everything is relative. I don't think we should accept things in other communities that we should never accept in our own. Allowing people in, say, poorer developing countries to suffer indignities that we would never tolerate in our society is a double standard. And to me, it's borderline racism. While embracing multicultural diversity is a good, positive thing, I think we also have to accept that beyond a certain point, a live and let live attitude ceases to be liberal, ceases to be liberating, and can become oppressive. So, for example, when some years ago we had the example of conservatives within the Sikh community opposing the play Betsy, which was trying to highlight male supremacy and sexual abuse within the Sikh community. A lot of people in that community didn't want that, what they saw as dirty linen, being aired in public, even though the author was herself from a Sikh background, and she felt, in the name of multiculturalism, these issues had for too long been swept under the carpet. We also, of course, see sometimes the persecution of Sikhs who happen to be gay, or Sikhs who subscribe to a different minority faction of Sikhism. I think it's true that all people possess a culture, but this doesn't mean that all cultural values are equally valid and commendable. I think it's true to say, and I think we should say it, that some values and ideas are better than others. The Enlightenment was better than the Dark Ages. Freedom is better than slavery. Democracy is better than fascism. An egalitarian society is better than an elitist one. Peace is better than war. Social justice is better than social injustice. Scientific knowledge is better than superstition. And future civilizations will no doubt be better than our own. So, while all human beings deserve human rights, not everyone's traditions and beliefs deserve respect. Political and religious ideas that are based on racism, patriarchy, homophobia, and class privilege are unworthy, in my view, of respect. They need to be challenged. They should never be indulged in the name of multiculturalism and respect for cultural diversity. We need to assert those fundamental principles that human rights are universal for everyone on this planet, no matter who they are, no matter what their culture or background, that we stand with them in solidarity that they may be free. Thank you.